Martin Bucer is our next character to actually speak of. His entire career, or his entire ministry, I should say, was centered in the city of Strasbourg, which is a German city that also has great French connections to it as well. But Martin Bucer, he's an interesting character. He's simultaneously, Philip Schaff said, he's simultaneously the most neglected reformer and also the most influential. In fact, Martin Bucer influenced guys like Ulrich Zwingli, who was a Swiss reformer, influenced guys like Philip Melanchthon, who was successor to Luther, influenced guys like John Calvin, and later Theodore Beza. It's also interesting about Bucer is that Bucer was pretty much universally liked. Even though this was a time of great division, it's very difficult for historians, or even for people in the day, to dislike Martin Bucer. From what we can tell, he was a rather large, jolly man who enjoyed a good laugh. What's interesting, what I find the most interesting about him is Hilaire Belloc, who was a good friend of G.K. Chesterton's, who was a Catholic historian and Catholic writer, and was quite frankly angrily pro-Catholic, or polemical as we sometimes call it. In other words, he really was looking for a fight over Catholic theology, in which he would essentially try to slam you into the ground with his beliefs. Even Belloc looked at Martin Bucer and found him as a problem, because Martin Bucer by himself disproved the theory that all reformers were sour-faced and serious. So that really is kind of the introduction to who Martin Bucer was. Furthermore, as I mentioned, he was a man who enjoyed a good joke or a good laugh. In fact, at the Council of Marburg, while Luther was busy debating Ulrich Zwingli over how communion should actually be practiced, Martin Bucer decided to kind of lighten the mood by impersonating the various popes of the day. And he actually gave quite good impressions. And so that really is a good introduction to who he actually is and was. He was born in 1491 in the region of Alsace-Lorraine, which is right there between France and Germany. Studied eventually at the University of Paris and the University of Cologne, and entered the Dominican order in 1512. It was sometime during this era that through his readings he encountered a man who became his hero even though he was long dead. That man's name was John Tauler. He actually lived from 1300 to 1361. He was a fellow Dominican who was also from Strasbourg, who had also went to the University of Cologne. And he was an incredible preacher, but perhaps what was most interesting about him was that even back in the 1300s, the days of Wycliffe, and perhaps even influenced by Wycliffe, or influenced Wycliffe, he himself preached in the common tongue of German. He preached in the Vulgar, in the actual vernacular. His favorite passage that Bucer really latched onto was Isaiah 64:6, which simply says that your righteousness is like filthy rags. In other words, the most disgusting rag, or the most disgusting piece of underwear that's been worn over and over again, to be a little crass here, that essentially, if you can imagine what that would be like, or you take a guy like James VI, who never bathed so much that they had to peel his clothing off of him. Well, that clothing, which is now revolting you through the images that I've given you, that clothing essentially is equivalent to your righteousness. In other words, your righteousness is nothing special to God. Your righteousness is nothing special, period, because it is still completely fallen and marred by sin. In other words, what this taught Bucer was it taught him that he could not take himself too seriously. Hence the whole idea that he was actually able to have a bit of a laugh. By 1520, he decided to leave the actual Dominican order. He no longer saw it as being beneficial to his ministry. He no longer saw its very disciplines as being helpful to the path that was actually set out for him. The following year, he married. He was actually one of the first reformers to do so. And he strongly advocated that others marry as well, especially those in the pastorate, because of how busy the life was. In fact, he said this: wives are good things. All that is evil and destructive in us, they will humiliate. It might be a bit of an exaggeration, but he recognized that the actual pursuit and wooing of a woman, and the continual wooing of a woman over a lifetime, does something positive towards your sanctification as a man. And thus, it was something that he strongly advocated to his fellow pastors. In fact, it's kind of funny, as people began to leave the monasteries and leave the nunneries and leave this whole old order of sacerdotalism the Catholics had, he actually played kind of a matchmaker between the ex-nuns and the ex-monks and those who had come out of that whole order. By 1522, just a year after being married, he became pastor of the largest church in Strasbourg. Now, what's interesting about this whole role that he played in Strasbourg was that Bucer, even though he recognized that there was a type of movement going on around him, that there was this kind of cultural-wide shift that he was at kind of the forefront of, Bucer always saw his primary duty to his actual parish or congregation at Strasbourg. So he spent most of his time writing letters. He did not go on these large circuits trying to gather lots of people and tell them the same message every time. Rather, he was much more interested in the care of souls. It's very similar to what you see in one of the early reformers, such as Gregory the Great, who wrote the whole manual on how pastors should actually care for individual souls. Eventually, he would make his way to England. In fact, by the last couple of years of his life, he spent in England helping Thomas Cranmer write the Book of Common Prayer. He did all of these things in the last year of his life. He actually died in 1551. But what Bucer did was he brought together the various reformers. He actually helped find common ground between, because many of them had different ideas about how the Scriptures should actually be applied to both things like church order, to things like the civil government, to things like how sanctification actually works. But more importantly, Bucer actually modeled the whole absolute importance of actually caring for individual people in your congregation. And that also became a part of the spirit of the Reformation.